In part 10, I'd like to talk about reflexive verbs. Now, as we know, reflexive verbs are everywhere in Spanish. In fact, there's a lot of things that you cannot say unless you use a verb reflexively. Now, the question is, what happens to them in the subjunctive? Let's take the verb quedar. On its own, it means to remain. If you make it reflexive, meaning quedarse, it means to remain oneself. And they use this in Spanish to mean to stay. Now, if we conjugate it normally, it becomes me quedo, te quedas, se queda, nos quedamos, se quedan. This would be I stay myself, you stay yourself, he, she, or it stays himself, herself, or itself. We stay ourselves, and they say themselves. The big question then becomes, how would you conjugate it in the subjunctive? Now, what I'd like you to do is pause and try. We'll go back to the slide where it's just conjugated regularly. Now, you know that in the subjunctive, verbs defect over to the other side. So here with quedarse, we have an AR verb. So try to go down the list and conjugate it, but in the subjunctive form. The answer would be me quede, te quedes, se quede, nos quedemos, se queden. Putting them side by side, you can see how the verb has defected over to the other side. It was an AR verb, but it is behaving as though it was not, as if it were an ER or an IR verb. Notice that the pronouns didn't change at all. They remained stationary. It was simply that the main verb quedar switched sides and all of the reflexive pronouns remained stationary. This is the mechanics of how reflexive verbs work in the subjunctive. Let's try another. On its own, llamar means to call. But if we make it reflexive, meaning llamarse, now it means to call one's self. And we use this to say my name is or your name is and so forth. Now, conjugating it normally, we have me llamo, te llamas, se llama, nos llamamos, and se llaman. Here we have an AR verb, llamar. This means I call myself, you call yourself. He, she, or it calls himself, herself, or itself. We call ourselves, and they call themselves. Again, the question becomes, how would you conjugate it in the subjunctive? Again, pause and try, and I'll put the slide back up for you. It becomes me llame, te llames, se llame, nos llamemos, se llamen. You can see the same mechanic at work. This was an AR verb, but the main verb switched sides and behaved as though it were an ER or an IR verb. And just as before, all of the reflexive pronouns remained stationary. What I'm showing you here is that on the surface, reflexive verbs in the subjunctive look complicated. They look hard. But once you understand the mechanics going on underneath them, it helps to remove the mystery and they get a lot easier to manage. Let's work a bit more with quedarse. First of all, how would you say I stay? Me quedo. I stay here. Me quedo aquí. Now let's introduce a subjunctive trigger. He wants me to stay here. Firstly, how would you rephrase that? It becomes, he wants that I stay here. Now try to say that in Spanish. Quiere que me quede aquí. Here you see the trigger, he wants, quiere que. So instead of me quedo, the reflexive verb changed into me quede. This is another example of such a simple sentence, such an ordinary thing to say. He wants me to stay here. Yet in Spanish, it would require the use of a reflexive verb and in the subjunctive. How would you say, he needs me to stay here? Necesita que me quede aquí. He hopes that I stay here. Espera que me quede aquí. It's important that I stay here. Es importante que me quede aquí. Let's try to work the other angles. How would you simply say, you stay here tonight? Te quedas aquí esta noche. Now let's throw a subjunctive trigger into the mix. He wants you to stay here tonight. Quiere que te quedes aquí esta noche. She stays here tomorrow. How would you say that? Se queda aquí mañana. He hopes she stays here tomorrow. Espera que se quede aquí mañana. How do you say we stay here? Nos quedamos aquí. Now say he needs us to stay here. Necesita que nos quedemos aquí. To say one night more would be una noche más. Now say he needs us to stay here one night more. Necesita que nos quedemos aquí una noche más. How do you say they stay with me? Se quedan conmigo. Now say he would like that they stay with me one more night. Le gustaría que se queden conmigo una noche más. So, in summary, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by reflexive verbs in the subjunctive. They look strange and they also carry along these reflexive pronouns with them. Now this happens when you only look at them on the surface. In order to simplify them, you must look deeper and understand the mechanics of what's going on underneath. In other words, the mechanics of how they work. So they are switching sides, defecting, just like all the other verbs. It's just that they're taking the reflexive pronouns with them, kind of along for the ride. Now remember, as far as pronouns, there's only 4 of them. We have me, meaning myself, te, meaning yourself, and this one, se, which is so powerful, himself, herself, itself, oneself, and themselves, and finally nos, representing ourselves. If you were at all hesitant through this video, I would like you to watch it again because it's very important that you get comfortable with reflexive verbs, including in the subjunctive.